16. Blood Circuit. The Cruach of Cathedral was a place of dust and silence. Tragedy hung in the air, infusing the place with an understanding of its loss. A silent whisper descended on the city, drowning the alleys and the towers and the factories. Cathedral heard the rumours of death. The set knew. The grey Mandelbrot faces were still stone slabs. A frightened silence sapped their arrogance. Bernice Summerfield knew. She knew because she was now as much a part of the city as the set. Her anger was reserved for the Mandelbrot set. Benny stared up at them, seeing cancerous grey stains spread across the wall. They had sent the grey man to die in a war which he did not want and could not win. Benny herself had been the lever with which they forced him to act. She felt used. The grey man's body lay at her feet. There was grey blood on her hands. She was upset and angry. She turned, prepared to march out of the Cruach, but found the exit blocked by citizens dressed in elaborate robes decorated with stark death's head shapes. Their masks were blank metal. One of the Mandelbrot heads rumbled uneasily, as if clearing its throat. When it spoke, its voice was light, without the normal self-assurance. "He dies," it said, slurring through a ghastly parody of a memorial address. "These, Gabriel and Tanith, have killed him. Evident it is that Cathedral may not stand up to these. We are confounded. Where is our course?" Another Mandelbrot spoke, its voice retaining some arrogance. This was the first time Benny had heard one Mandelbrot address another. It was like listening to a schizophrenic arguing with itself. "He stepped into the bounds of death. His soul was willingly spent to spite us. His care for the program is sham. He destabilizes our efforts. He seeks the ruin of Cathedral. He betrays us." The Mandelbrot voice screamed into higher pitches of hysteria. A third head took over. "Courses of action should be decided upon of an immediacy," it droned. "Otherwise Cathedral gives way to entropy. Survival of the program is imperative." Close ranks, warbled a smaller face on the edge of the ranks of the set. The others inclined their fixed faces towards it and strained to nod. "We must conserve. Seal Cathedral against the outer realities. We must be fasces. Bound rods become. Axe strike when threatened." At this, the entire set screamed its agreement, and Benny felt a ghost headache twinging inside her reconstituted skull. Then she felt heavy hands falling on her shoulders and locking her forearms. "Take this one," a Mandelbrot cried. "Her existence threatens the city. She is outsider, alien. Worse, she conspires with the traitor builder. For her, execution." Benny's mouth opened, but there was a rag-gloved hand clasped over her face and her yells were blocked. Thrashing ineffectually, Benny felt herself being borne away, dragged outside by the citizens. The harsh voices of the Mandelbrot set squawked behind her, echoing across the soulless city. "Protect and survive! Protect and survive!" Benny was dead, and Ace felt angry. At first it had been a sentimental, irrational anger that left her screaming inside. That had changed. Numb disbelief had given way to a sad, pragmatic acceptance of the reality of her friend's death. Her anger became cold and callous, geared to rage, to revenge. She stopped thinking about who she could blame for Benny's death. She began to consider her actions. Ace's anger focused on Gabriel and Tanith and the best ways to kill them. Open aggression was out. She'd tried it. It didn't work. She needed a more imaginative approach. Ruthlessly logical, she decided that her efforts would be best served by bringing the survivors of TARDIS and Household together for a brainstorming session. Even if no one else could come up with anything, the Doctor would have some scheme up his sleeve. Shit. Cliché. The Doctor wasn't interested. That was great. That was just bloody great. Ace had never seen him so disinterested. He squatted in the cellar, withdrawn into contemplation. He answered questions with an unintelligibly low murmur. Ace guessed he was wallowing in self-examination and angst and similar psychoanalytical crap. Ace had gone through patches of depression in the past, but she had been a kid and she'd grown out of it. Watching a grown man endure the same was embarrassing. No, she was being cruel. Benny's death had got right to the core of him. Ace didn't like it, but she understood. She just wished he'd snap out of it and do something. But then the doctor had never been very practical. She'd seen his moods before, but nothing quite as dense and disturbing as this. Here was a Time Lord on the verge of neurosis, Ace decided, and she felt bitter. Who else? Sandra was no use. The last time Ace saw her, she was a panicking whirlwind figure, disappearing from the cellar in an uncoordinated rush. Ace heard her later, sobbing behind the security of a locked bedroom door, just like a little girl. Ace realized she was judging too harshly. Her frustration was taking over. Cranley, too far gone to help. Ace had no idea where Gabriel had taken Paige, but Ace doubted that she would think of anything constructive. She was locked into a cycle of vicious, unthinking aggression. Ace was a big fan of aggression, but she knew when to give it a rest. She was beginning to think she was the only one left without severe emotional problems, or with the balls to deal with a practical problem in a practical way. There was Winterdawn. She didn't like him, but he was in better spirits than most others in this house. She believed the doctor had a quiet respect for his intelligence and expertise. She'd find Winterdawn. If nothing else, he might be able to draw the doctor back into the game. Winterdawn had disappeared into the labyrinthine house the moment he'd reacclimatized himself to the sensation of walking. Briefly, Ace wondered why Gabriel and Tanith had restored movement to him, but she didn't dwell on it. She doubted they had any good reason. It had probably seemed like a good idea at the time. It made Winterdawn happy, and happiness was rare. He had probably disappeared off for a good long walk through the house, regaining his feel for its floors and stairways. Good for him, Ace thought. Winterdawn had a lot of energy. She could use that. The passages were empty, silent too. They were dead, Ace realized as she prowled in search of her quarry. Gabriel and Tanith had torn its heart out. It was no longer a fit place to live. No way was Winterdawn staying here once this was over. She didn't like him, but he didn't deserve this. Winterdawn's voice carried through the stillness, indistinct but audible. Ace caught the sound on the air and crouched, eagerly searching for its source. This was just like hunting, like tracking. Ace felt a little better. Winterdawn was talking earnestly in low tones. He was in one of the better furnished rooms at the front of the house. Once she had a voice to follow, Ace found it quickly. She reached the door, reached for the handle, let her hand fall. She held back. No particular reason, just instinct and lingering suspicion. And a question. Who is he talking to? That's not mine, A long, indistinct passage. Tetrahedron. I don't know anything about a TARDIS. What? Ace could feel her heart, a steady thump beneath her ribs. She could hear her breathing. Her lungs were like wheezing engines, inhaling and expelling whole atmospheres in one go. It was an irrational thought, but she was certain Winterdawn could hear. This was stupid. She was just scared. You can have the tetrahedron, and my promise that we won't harm you. That's not much. We could have all that and leave you with nothing. Tanith's voice. Ace's eyes narrowed. She'd been right. She'd been right all along. A tide of anger welled inside her. She rode it with vicious enthusiasm. It was nice to have someone easy to kill. So, what do you want? Winterdawn growled. Oh, we don't want anything, Gabriel replied smoothly. Your way is more interesting. And it touches us inside deep down, Tanith purred. To know that in our short time in this cosmos, will have done something truly good." There was far too much charm, far too much sincerity in that voice. "You mean you will—" Winterdawn's tone was almost incredulous. Ace wasn't impressed. "My dear fellow, yes," Gabriel enthused. "We have a small matter to deal with first." "How long?" Winterdawn asked cautiously. "Half an hour, perhaps less," Tanith estimated. "Your acquiescence over the tetrahedron was most generous. It will bring matters to a swifter conclusion than we expected." "And then?" "Then, Professor, then." Winterdawn coughed, and Ace could picture him shuffling uneasily in the room beyond the door. It was a particularly vivid picture, given that the last time she'd seen him he'd barely been able to stand. "This is far more important to me than you can understand. More important than this. Thank you." "Don't thank us now." "We'll be off then." Silence. Ace strained to listen. "Where are you going?" Winterdawn asked, suspicion trembling on his lips. Ace frowned, pondering on the precise nature of their deal. It didn't deflect her rage. The moment Winterdawn was alone, she would be there. He'll never walk again. "Nowhere." "Goodbye, Professor." Silence. Sick of the silence, Ace pushed herself into the room, determined to make a dramatic entrance. She screwed up. Neither of her feet ended up where they were supposed to be. Ace tried to compensate, swayed uneasily, then toppled forward. In an act of treachery, the floor slipped from beneath her, came up, and hit her in the face. Suddenly there was the hairy taste of carpet in her mouth, and a textured bruise running down one side of her face. She groaned, not so much with the pain as with shame. Awkwardly, she looked up and saw Gabriel and Tanith standing over her, their lowered faces fixed into gloating smiles, and their arms raised towards heaven. And suddenly, Ace could no longer hear the thump of her heart, and she was terrified that the beat had stopped for good. "If you can meet with triumph and disaster, and treat those two impostors just the same," the doctor murmured, "then yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and, which is more, you'll be a man, my son." He smiled sourly. He rubbed his face with the flat of his palm, detesting the worn, ugly texture of his flesh. He had left the cellar for no good reason, and was wandering the house for no good purpose. He was up to no good. No good could come of it. In his left hand he held a cracked and abandoned object, a mask that grinned incessantly despite the absence of any face behind it. In his right hand was a pyramidal object that glowed with blue light. Its edges were almost razor-sharp. He was thinking about what he should do. A door opened ahead of him, becoming a room. Lying before him on a bed was the corpse of Bernice Summerfield. He would have to arrange her burial. That would be an experience. He'd never buried friends before. They'd had so many interesting ways of dying, they rarely left corpses behind. Reduced to dust. Incinerated in antimatter explosions. No evidence, no corpse discipline. This time was different. "What am I going to do?" he asked, sitting by the body. "I don't know." Benny was beside him, radiating sympathy. "There's that place in Norfolk. You know the vicar." "Yes," the doctor nodded. "Reverend Trelaw. I could ask him, but it would have to be done in secret. Otherwise the church would start asking awkward questions." Benny smiled and sat beside him. "I'm going to have to stop Gabriel and Tanith," the doctor mused, wondering if the dead could offer suggestions. The dead? She looked healthy enough. "You'd need a weapon of some variety," Benny told him. The doctor frowned, wondering why he had never noticed the Scots tinge to her accent before. He let it pass. "What sort of weapon?" "Ace says nothing works. Gabriel and Tanith are the universe. How do you kill the universe?" With a weapon that can kill universes, Benny said brightly. I'll ask Winterdawn. He's bound to have one stashed away somewhere. Benny laughed. It was pleasant, but it seemed to lack something, a vital, animating spark. Her smile. It wasn't Benny's. It was a smile he had only seen in mirrors. Bernice, he said slowly, do you think, perhaps, that it might be better if I died? Would that be a good way out? That would be shameful and cowardly and wasteful, Benny told him in strict tones. It's not good for anyone to die, Doctor. Not even Gabriel and Tanith. Not even them. You might have to kill them, but you respect life in all its forms. Bloody little hypocrite. The Doctor smiled wearily. Then I need a weapon, he said. Gabriel and Tanith didn't move. They had even stopped breathing. They smiled, but serenely, vacuously. Their eyes were closed. They didn't move. Ace gave Gabriel a shove. He swayed unsteadily, then righted himself. Ace allowed herself a callous smile. She placed a fingernail against Tanith's chin and made a small scratch. The woman didn't stir. They're like statues. Winterdawn was at her side, and for a moment she forgot her antipathy. They've just been standing there. Statues. Right. Gabriel and Tanith were gone. They'd put themselves into a trance or let their minds wander. They'd left their bodies as monuments to themselves. Ace stared from one to the other, wondering what she could do. She remembered seeing these bodies broken by gunfire. There was no sign of that now. These bodies were whole and unblemished. And without their guiding minds to repair them, they were vulnerable. There was a fireplace set in one wall, ready for cold winter's nights. The hearth was empty and cold, devoid even of ashes. Ace stared at the implements gathered around it. She reached for the poker. Quite heavy. Nice swing. Could do a lot of damage if applied in the right manner. Angels in marble, she told Winterdawn, winking at him. She raised her arm, ready to bring the poker down to make contact against Tanith's neck. She held her arm high just for a second, enjoying the heaviness, the sense of satisfaction, the potency of the moment. She held her arm high for a second too long. Winterdawn stepped forward and snapped a hand around her wrist. He was stronger than Ace would have expected. The swing would not come. The moment was lost. No, please. Winterdawn sounded reasonable but pleading. Ace was disgusted, frustrated. She caught him with a curious, aggressive gaze. Ever since she'd first laid eyes on him, she realized, she had really, really wanted to beat him into a whimpering mess. Bastard! She spat. You sold us out! You don't understand, Winterdawn mouthed. Ace stared at him, seeing not a betrayer, but a worthless old man. She saw him withering in her gaze, his brittle body sinking into itself. Worthless. She dismissed him unthinkingly and turned back to the two still figures. They were still, defenceless. Beautiful, frozen angels in a beautiful, frozen tableau. They were the real enemy. And it was beautiful. Ace's eyes were painfully raw, ready for bitter tears. She raised the poker, weighing it eagerly in her palm. She was enjoying this too much. This was a locked moment, filled with energy and aggression that begged to be freed. This was a moment of potential. She would remain calm. She would smash them without feeling, definitely without relish, because it had to be done. She would try not to enjoy it. She owed that to Benny. But it was still beautiful. It is our considered opinion that violence solves nothing. The potential was spent, exhausted before its time. Ace's body sagged in disappointment, the poker slipping from her hands and hitting the floor with a crash. The howl that perched on her lips, ready to sing, vanished in a slipstream silence. Someone spoke, and the magic went away. She scooped up the poker and thrust it at Gabriel's shoulder, striking it at an awkward angle. A juddering pain drove up Ace's wrist. Ace snarled bitterly. She could still smash the statues of flesh and bone before her, but the thrill of destruction was gone. She had lost the poetry. She blamed Justin Cranley. He was framed in the doorway, arms folded and face smoothed into an expression of sympathetic melancholia. There was as much sadness in his eyes as there had been in his voice. Madness too, Ace reckoned, but a coherent madness. Ace didn't dwell on the miracle of his recovery. She was too angry to focus on anything other than the immediate. "What did you say?" she hissed, raising the poker. It was supposed to look threatening, but Ace's hand was shaking, and the poker shook with it. It ruined the effect. Ace felt her self-confidence crumbling. Cranley was calm and composed, and everything that Ace wasn't. She hated that. Hated. "Violence solves nothing," Cranley said softly, trying not to match Ace's glare. His eyes were focused on a patch of the carpet beside the doorframe. There were shadows round his eyes. Ace saw this and felt nothing. "So? What are you going to do about it?" Nothing. Cranley jiggled his head, and a light smile came to his lips. "I just think you should think things through." "I've thought things through, and I'm going to kill them," Ace spat. "I'm going to smash every bloody bone in their bodies. Now shut up and let me get on with it." Cranley nodded. Ace grunted, satisfied, and hefted the poker. "It won't work, though." "What?" Ace snapped. "You won't kill them. They're statues. Flesh statues with bones and nerves and blood, built to house spirits. Smash the bodies and the spirits grow new shapes. You're working off your aggression on inanimate objects." "You're so smart," Ace decided to call his bluff. "Tell me where their spirits have got to." Cranley shook his head wearily. "We don't know. They're communicating with us from a great distance. They want us to defend their bodies in the absence of spirit. If you attack, they want me to intercede on their behalf." Ace blinked. "We refuse. We don't do that. We've known the darkness, the shadows. We know what is pointless and what is not. We know." A brief pause, punctuated by a moan from Winterdawn. "Oh," Cranley said, the sadness on his face growing. "They are unbinding the DNA of our host. Cranley will dissolve. When it is gone, he will be dead. But our minds will be annihilated. There is no hope for us." "Who's we?" "The many minds, the might-have-beens. We've been brought together in this vessel. It's an incredible experience. So many different ways of thinking, so many cultures. We're getting along well. A little acid-head anarchists commune in JC's skull." Cranley paused. "We can't last. Not without a body." "You're a sad, sick man," Ace growled. "You need help." She turned away from the madman and swung the poker against the side of Tanith's torso. There was a satisfying crunch of harsh metal against soft flesh. But Cranley was whispering another gobbet of madness in her ear. "I think you should know," he purred. "There are others of us Gabriel and Tanith could call on, more amenable to their cause, more destructive too. In fact, we suggest you hit the floor. Now!" Then there were hands shoving her shoulders. Ace overbalanced and, once again, the floor leapt up to attack her, and the sore texture of the carpet bruised her exposed hands and face. Moments later, a chunk of plaster exploded out of the wall beside her. A bullet lodged in the fabric of the house. It was followed into the room by Jane Page. Wrapped around her clothes was a ragged, dirty towel, hanging limp from her shoulders like a loose cape. Her eyes were covered by a white handkerchief, stained a distinct red. "Behold the woman," Page declaimed. The grandiose arrogance in her voice was new to Ace. It was an arrogance that had lost all claim on sanity. "We are amused. We declare holidays from the tedious condition of life. Step forth, Ace, that we might knight her in a manner befitting." Silently, Ace sat up. She was wary, but she sensed little danger. Page had checked out for lunch, and she wasn't coming back. What remained of her was so grotesque it was entertaining. "It may seem to you, Ace, that I have departed for that realm where madness rules as queen," Paige purred, fingering the trigger of her gun. Her old sardonic sanity had returned to her voice, but Ace wasn't worried. It was an act, no more. "While I might seem strange at times, you'll be glad to hear that not only have I retained skill, speed, and sharpness, but I have been transfigured with new vision. I have no eyes, but I can see. I see clearer than before, and I will find you. I am invested with divine vision. I am the monarch of assassins, and my power derives from God." "You don't believe in God?" Ace sneered. And suddenly there was the barrel of a gun pressed against her temple, but by that time it was too late to make right her mistake. That was stupid. It might have been the old, saner Paige. Mad or not, she pulled the trigger. Winterdawn's body smashed into her side and knocked her gun arm wild. Ace found herself breathing and was surprised. She decided to let surprise give way in favour of survival. She pounced up and pitched herself through the door, narrowly beating Cranley in the flight from the room. Gunshots exploded behind her. She felt nothing. There was a passageway before her, stretching in two directions. Winterdawn was at one end, disappearing round a corner into the dark confines of his house. Justin Cranley pushed past her and fled down the other passage. A bullet drilled into the wall beside her, and Ace took a snap decision, hurling herself into one corridor and running and running and running until she was lost in a maze of delirious architecture. This time, though, the maze was built by little more than her own perception and a terrible fear of joining Benny in the arms of death. Bernice Summerfield had lived alongside death for most of her lifetime. She had faced it many times and lived to compare experiences. There were no good ways to die, but many bad ones. The very worst she could think of was death by hanging. It was the last thing she wanted to experience. So now, the citizens of Cathedral were going to hang her. She was taken to Golgotha, the place of execution. She went directly to Golgotha. She did not pass go. She did not collect £200. She was taken there by the city militia, tall citizens in heavy black robes and no faces beyond their cold steel masks. The masks were blemished by grooves and pockmarks, but there were no holes in the blank wholeness of metal. Benny was taken to the place of execution, aboard a vehicle that the grey man had pointed out to her during a more pleasant moment. A war machine constructed to fight back the great snake that had breached the city walls millions of years earlier. It was a bloated, overgrown mess of engineering. Every gear, every piston, every cog, every working part was exposed and fluid. The machinery growled and throbbed and churned and pumped and seethed. Clouds of soot erupted from the chimneys at the machine's rear. At least 10 robed citizens sweated as they shovelled tons of coal into the engine, attempting to satiate its ceaseless hunger. At the aft stood the helm citizen, arms strapped to the wheel, waiting for the chance to steer the beast. Where the helm citizen was patient, the machine screamed with mechanical expectation. Once Benny was safe aboard, a signal was given, a harsh peal of a bell, and the machine roared with joyous life. It lurched forward under a black pall, ploughing through the streets towards Golgotha. It was to be a public occasion, one of the militia said. Half Cathedral would be there. There was a sense of enthusiasm and expectation in the streets, driving out the uncertainty left by the death of the city's soul. Benny caught a snatch of the atmosphere and cheered up for a moment. At other times she brooded. She understood exactly what was going to happen, but harsh reality of death hadn't stamped itself into her heart. There were airships floating over the city skyline. They gathered like a swarm of black, bloated insects over Golgotha Square, hovering in anticipation of the revels. Cradles of all sizes hung from the bodies of the airships, but the largest and the best decorated were reserved for the watching stone heads of the Mandelbrot set. Even they couldn't resist the allure. Vultures. As the machine growled closer towards Golgotha, one of Benny's guards bound her wrists together behind her back. She didn't resist. She had caught futility. There was no escape from the city, save for the path she was offered. A second guard held a flower to her face, a glorious, healthy red rose, its stem covered in fine thorns. The guard pushed the stem into Benny's mouth and told her, in curious, cracked tones, to bite on it. She bit. She tasted chlorophyll. "Keep it clenched between your teeth," said the guard. "Eventually, it falls of its own accord." Benny shivered. Golgotha Square was a vast openness, a plain of grey slabs at a point where major roads intersected. In the centre was a gallows beckoning. A crowd gathered round it, waiting for someone to die. They stood shoulder to shoulder in still and formal ranks. There was no real enthusiasm there, only what the city itself had instilled in them. Benny was dragged to the gallows while the crowd watched with rapturous silence. Benny saw masks and robes around her. Time became muted and fluid, and the world washed around her. Fleeting impressions, so unreal. She saw the steel faces of her guards, the black-wrapped outline of the executioner, two fat hands fondling the lever that would open the door to oblivion, the chessboard-patterned mask of the officiating dignitary, a stooped creature, bent to half its height, standing only with the help of an obsidian rod. There was a rose in her mouth, there was a flimsy trapdoor beneath her feet, there was a noose around her neck. Finally, Bernice Summerfield knew what was happening, and she began to panic. It was a quiet panic. She trembled in silence. She wanted to say something, but there was a rose between her teeth, and when it fell, it would be too late. She still liked to think of Cathedral as a computer. The grey man wouldn't have liked it, but she suspected that he simply had a habitual dislike for technology. No, Cathedral was a computer network. Everything she perceived was distorted images of the matrix of data surrounding her. She was corrupt data that would be erased painlessly. She had died once. She could die again. It was a good analogy. No, it was a stupid analogy. This wasn't a computer. This was real, and she was going to die. She stared across the panorama of meaningless masks and featureless faces. She wondered if they knew what was really happening now, how significant it was. Trembling, she wondered how much longer she had. The anticipation was killing her. In a minute, she was going to cry, and she wanted to be dead before she started. The dignitary shuffled forward, still resting on its rod. The staff was a long shaft, tipped with a sharp metal point that squealed against the wooden floor as its owner moved. The sound set Benny's teeth on edge. She almost laughed at herself for dwelling on something so petty. "Citizens of Cathedral," the hunchback announced. "A funny thing happened to me on the way here." The crowd was unresponsive. Unperturbed, the dignitary continued. "A very peculiar thing indeed happened. There are rumours in the night, rumours that we are all lost on a tiny ship floundering in the storm of all oceans." Now the ancient voice seemed to echo, each deeper than the last. The response from the crowd remained underwhelming. "I'm sorry," the voice of the citizen continued to drone, perhaps a little smoother, a little sadder than before. "I never said I loved you. I just want your money. I'm reminded of a similar occasion on the 11th of September, 1772, at Aix in France, when the Marquis de Sade was executed in effigy because they hadn't caught him yet." "They're not in the mood for it," Benny called lightly through her clenched teeth. "But you're not very funny, and it's not you they've come to see." Benny felt cheated. Even on the occasion of her death, she felt like she was on the periphery of the action. The dignitary straightened up, raising its cane towards the crowd. The rod was held horizontally, clenched in a firm fist that extended from the citizen's body on the end of a rigid arm. "All the world's a stage," a figure whispered, so that only Benny could hear. Then the dignitary's arm was flung back, curving in a smooth, violent arc. Its hand was empty, palm flat and fingers splayed. The crowd's silence became deeper, gaining a dangerous quality. The staff impaled the executioner. Its sharp steel point erupted from his back. Blood bubbled from the wound, dribbling lazily down the death robes. The executioner fell over, probably more from surprise than from death. Benny's guards kicked forward. Knives erupted in their hands. The dignitary seemed unconcerned. The crowd buzzed expectantly, their bloodlust well satisfied. The guards fell upon the murderer, and the light blazed off the angles of their knives. An anonymous citizen mounted the platform so quickly, in the midst of such turmoil, that its entrance almost went unnoticed. Benny saw it first. She was the first to see the machine gun cradled in its arms. Fire blazed from the barrel, accompanied by the spit of bullets. 2 short bursts. The militia fell. Blood flowed freely on the wooden floor of the gallows. The armed citizen turned to the crowd and, with a burst of gunfire into the sky, created a wave of panic. Its comrade had already snatched up one of the fallen knives and was scurrying across the stage towards Bernice. The dignitary tore the noose from Bernice's neck, then slashed the cord binding her hands together. Benny found herself breathing again. The rose slipped from her teeth. "What's your name?" "Bernice Summerfield," Benny replied wearily. Her eyelids flickered heavily, a sudden exhaustion gnawing at her heart. "Middle name?" She was too tired to speak. "Surprise!" A hood was thrown back, and a mask stripped away. Tanith smiled, producing a second machine gun from her robes. "Welcome to Golgotha. Can you use one of these?" She didn't wait for an answer, preferring to shove it straight into Benny's waiting arms. Benny stared down at the gun, wondering numbly what it was and what she was supposed to do with it. And then she woke up, and she understood what she was holding and how she might use it. With cold deliberation, she raised the gun so that it aimed directly into Tanith's face. "What are you doing?" she hummed in a voice thick with lingering suspicion and potent aggression. Tanith reacted with a rich, wet smile. "Tanith, Benny," Tanith's co-conspirator called. It was now wearing both the voice and the face of Gabriel. Startled back into a practical frame of mind, Benny lowered the gun and inclined her head to see the object of Gabriel's concern. Golgotha was covered in shadow. A thick, fat, cigar-shaped shadow cast by the largest of the dirigibles hanging over the execution square. 3 stone-featured Mandelbrot stared over the side at the insurrection. "Surrender! Surrender!" squawked all 3 Mandelbrot heads together, though not quite in unison. Their voices overlapped each other, turning the chant into a chorus of chaos, noise, and discord. Below them, the cathedral militia were strutting warily across Golgotha towards the stage. Each was armed, radiating an air of caution. Benny's eyes flicked from Tanith to Gabriel and back again. Gabriel's face was depressed and revealing nothing. Tanith was still smiling. One of her hands was hidden in the shadow curves of her robes. Benny looked closer and saw a small black globe cupped in the palm of the invisible hand. A fuse was strung from the globe's surface, a long, thin cord whose end flickered with fire. Benny looked into Tanith's eyes and saw the same fire there. "Come now," she whispered. "They're good sports." In one single smooth motion, she pulled the globe out of the lining of her clothes and pitched it into space. It flew through the air, the fuse burning low. Gabriel and Tanith had already thrown themselves flat onto the floor. Benny joined them, but not before seeing the globe land perfectly at the feet of the leading citizen. She was already on the floor with her head held low when the globe exploded. She didn't see the explosion, fortunately. The flash would have burned her eyes dry. She felt the winds dragging at her, fruitlessly trying to tear her from the safety of the gallows. She heard the screams of the militia as the winds caught them, sucking them into the heart of the brief, angry firestorm. The screams didn't disturb her. They weren't human screams. They were only imitations. Cathedral wasn't real, nor were its citizens. They just sounded real. The screams didn't disturb her until she thought about them. When the screaming stopped, she looked up and saw that a large area of Golgotha's flagstone floor had turned death black. There were no bodies. Only the citizen who stood closest to the globe remained, as a white shadow burned into the heart of the black. Other citizens had been distant enough to escape the nuke flash. Some carried small arms and skidded across the blackened square, firing at the gallows. Bullets and chunks of wood exploded round Benny, and she threw herself to the ground again. "Shoot them down!" screamed the Mandelbrot. "Wade in gore!" Gabriel and Tanith threw themselves from the gallows platform, leaping joyfully across the square, howling as they returned fire with enthusiasm to equal that of their enemy. Certain in the knowledge of their survival, they charged berserk to the battle. The ground that had been stained black became stained red. Benny kept her head held low. She didn't want to kill anyone, but she had the disquieting feeling that she had started this massacre, the events leading to it. The vicious glee her allies brought to the slaughter sickened her. They revelled in the tide of blood. But Cathedral was not a real place, and the only real person who had ever lived here was dead. She reached for her gun, finding its weight and the feel of its cold skin unpleasant. She raised her head, wondering where to begin. "Summerfield!" The Mandelbrot voice was close and spiteful. It rekindled the anger Benny had felt in the Kruak chamber. She hated that voice. For the first time since taking up the gun, she had the urge to use it. The Mandelbrot airship was lower now, the passenger cradle level with the gallows stage. Less than 3 yards gap separated Benny from the closest head. She leapt to her feet, her caution smothered by a thrilling, aggressive anger. The air between her and the airship was empty, and she kicked herself through it. A citizen of the militia was waiting for her, a vicious, short-bladed knife in its hand. Its mask was blank. Benny shot it, once, twice, 3 times. Benny fired until the knife fell from its hand and the body collapsed on the deck. Her nerves and her mind were numb. It wasn't real, it was only a game. Benny felt nothing. When the crew member's body was twitching on the ground and dead beyond doubt, she turned to train her gun on the helpless stone faces of the Mandelbrot set. "Take this airship to Cuba," she demanded. "You will die for this," one of the heads declaimed, and Benny killed herself laughing. Then she saw the body on the deck. Silence reigned locally. Both Benny and the Mandelbrot set could hear the gunfire from the square, but as the moment stretched longer, the sounds became less frequent. Then total silence asserted itself. It ended less than a minute later when Gabriel and Tanith climbed aboard, bloody and victorious. "Permission to come aboard," Gabriel called. Benny nodded, suppressing a smile. "This is piracy," roared a stonehead, but no one, least of all Benny, dignified it with attention. The set grew aloof, saying nothing more to the boarders. The pirates themselves were too busy at the controls of the airship to say much. The flight began in silence. Golgotha Square fell away until it was a small grey dot in the vastness of the city. Cathedral was no less ugly seen from above, but now the ugliness was revealed as a magnificent sprawling design. The towers of the city were like grasping hands, reaching up to drag them down from the sky, but it was too late. The airship rose high into the clouds over the city, beyond the height of the tallest towers. It was so high now, the crew could see the stars through the grey smear clouds. The city was on fire. Whole areas of the city burned, flames licking as high as the Kruak itself. The stench of the burning wafted into the atmosphere. Benny caught the stench and began to gag. "They're burning the myths," Tanith said solemnly, no trace of humour in her voice. "They're purging the city of the cultures that flourished in its streets, the creatures nurtured by Cathedral's soul." "They?" Benny asked. "The Mandelbrot set," Gabriel intoned. Both he and his sister spoke in sadder voices than Benny had ever heard them use before. "You've known us a while, Bernice. You might think we don't care about anything." "You don't," Benny said bluntly, recalling exactly who her allies were and what they had done. "Perhaps not, but we can mourn." After this, the set will turn on the functions of the city, the citizens. They need to make things nice and homogeneous. The only things they will allow to live are the other Mandelbrot. Then they will fight among themselves until one remains, where a city once stood, crowning itself monarch of all time and space. That was terrible, one thing among many. "But not now," Gabriel announced, with considerably more enthusiasm than before. There was a vicious smile on his lips, and Tanith's too. Brother and sister locked arms and began to dance around the deck, whooping and howling and laughing in the eye of the storm. "Cathedral dies," one of the Mandelbrot voices intoned, too low for any but Benny to hear. "Your insurrection destabilizes structure. The entropy we control consumes us now. You have killed the city." And as Benny watched, a star fell from the sky, landing on the city and exploding in a spectacular display of light and fire. Others followed its path to the ground. Gabriel and Tanith were laughing, and Benny felt nothing. It wasn't real. The doctor dropped the tetrahedron. Its surface was burning his palm. Benny was falling. The wind lashed her, tearing her hair, her face, her clothes. She plunged through a funnel of rushing air, hearing the voices of Gabriel and Tanith merged as one. The words were memories. She had heard them before on the airship, just before she had jumped overboard. "This was the point. The whole point. We can't touch the city, because we are its children, and we do not yet share its power. So we needed to introduce an independent mind into Cathedral, when the city was in its most critical state. The smallest disturbance could wreck this place. An independent mind would do that." "Sucker!" "We have an appointment with Sandra Winterdawn now, but that's okay. We can leave. There's no way out for you. You'll stay here and die with it." "Die?" "You killed it for us. We used you so easily. Because, you see, we are tied to this place. We want its corpse. Then we will be free." "What's the matter? Why aren't you laughing?" At that point, Bernice Summerfield jumped overboard. As she fell, she heard Gabriel and Tanith speaking again and again and again. The ground accelerated towards her, and she was fully conscious when it hit her. The sky was a bleak grey, the colour of tears. The grass was the colour of stone. The food had the texture and taste of excrement. They were three, Winterdawn and his daughter, and one other who was not there and appeared as a shadow. Winterdawn hugged himself, loving this dream. Sandra was a statue with a robot voice that broke the cosy reminiscence. Winterdawn loved her. Her questions were awkward, questions like, "Where's Mummy?" Like, "Why can't I see?" Like, "What came first, the chicken or the egg?" They springboarded into existence out of nowhere simultaneously, Winterdawn told his daughter seriously. "We call this the free lunch theory." Winterdawn opened his eyes and lost his memory. He was in his daughter's bedroom. In the middle of the room were the two people he recognized as Gabriel and Tanith. They were smiling at him, vicious little smiles that stabbed at Winterdawn like hot needles. Their clothes were red, wet butcher's aprons. "Sandra," Winterdawn said. Not his voice, too distant. "You can thank us now," Gabriel said happily. "Her eyes," Winterdawn continued in his quiet, wistful little voice. "Over there," Gabriel gestured, and Winterdawn did not look to see where he pointed. "I'll kill you for this," he said calmly, though there was a note of bitterness creeping in. "Kill you, you bastards! Kill you dead!" "You're too late." "We've won!" "Here comes the night." They left the room, and Winterdawn made no move to stop them. There were scraps of Sandra's clothing lying on the floor. "Why can't I see, Daddy?" Pain lurched up his leg, momentary, agonizing. Weakened, he sank to his knees. The strength in his legs was leaking away. He fell against the floor, and his immediate thoughts were concerned with how soft and wet it felt. He was in his daughter's bedroom. Without thinking, he began to cry. "Where can I find a weapon that can kill universes?" The doctor stared at his feet, at the object pulsing with a light which no longer burned as bright as it had done. "Our weapon that can kill universes," the doctor said. His voice was dry, and his face plastered with a grim smile. Cautiously, he touched the tetrahedron. His hands blistered under an intense but not intolerable heat. The light began to flicker and spit. Ha! He squatted on the floor by the crackling pyramid, easing himself into a familiar cross-legged position, as if in meditation. His hands pressed against separate flats of the pyramid, the light and heat tanning his palms. For a minute he sat in silence, trying to empty his mind. The pyramid offered no response, its blue light seeming like a lighter shade of black. The doctor's cheeks bristled red to match his hands. He intoned, trying to shake off his embarrassment. And the tetrahedron replied, "Doctor, where the hell have you been?" None of this is real. Benny lay still in the rubble of Cathedral, her arms and gun pinned under her, her face smothered in concrete dust, imitating the corpse she had expected she would become. She looked up and saw a city in ruins. She had landed intact and without pain in the heart of a quad that resembled Golgotha in architecture if not in scale. The quad was strewn with damage, both structural and human. Shattered buildings rose from its edges like rotten teeth from dead gums. Cathedral had been corrupt but solid. Now the corruption had eaten into the solidity, into the core. Benny looked up and saw a fragile corpse of a city. Jagged cracks opened in the floor of the quad. Black plants sprouted from the stone like tongues, pushing into the corpse for one final meal. Benny pulled herself clear of the rubble which had so improbably cushioned her fall, and began to strut around the square like the last barbarian in a ruined Rome. She had killed the city, driven the knife into its stone heart, and now she was lost, aimless. A meteorite fell out of the sky onto the place where Benny had fallen. It didn't survive the fall. It smashed apart on impact. Benny stared at the curious stone shape that now topped the pile of rubble. Even crushed into itself, it was familiar. Another meteorite smashed into tiny stone pieces. It was better preserved than the first, and Benny recognized it with a wry smile. It was raining Mandelbrot heads. Gabriel and Tanith must be throwing them off the airship. Benny shot a glance upwards and threw herself aside in time to avoid being crushed by the third of the briefly airborne heads. It splintered anonymously beside her. Benny smiled serenely. She was enjoying herself, mutedly. She was alone at the end of the world. She would die happy and fulfilled. Mystified, she considered, but happy and fulfilled nonetheless. Then a voice intruded on her peace. Benny threw her head back and screamed into the cracked sky. "Doctor, where the hell have you been?" "Benny, I'm here," Benny howled, waving her arms around to little effect. "You're not dead." "Oh, I'm dead. I just haven't stopped talking yet. You know me. I don't let these little details get in my way. Where are you?" "Winterdawn's room." The doctor's voice was smooth and wooden. Benny never noticed the emotion in his voice until it had gone. "With your body." "Good. You can get me back into it. You've got the tetrahedron?" "Yes." "Listen," Benny called, flattening her voice to match the doctor's. "I'm in a city called Cathedral. The tetrahedron is the extension of the city into real space. The city can manipulate reality, but I killed it. This was careless of me, I admit, but it's done now. It's dying, so for pity's sake, get me out of here." A pause. Benny ground her teeth in frustration. "How do I know that you're not an illusion, a hallucination, a trick of Gabriel and Tanith's?" Heavens, I'll be dead in a minute and the man's still concerned with proof. Have you ever considered tax inspection as a career choice? Oh, bloody hell, Doctor, Benny snapped. Can't you just— Summerfield. The growl cut her short. The growl of a Mandelbrot voice laced with aggression. She hadn't heard that streak of violence before. Summerfield, growled the last of the Stoneheads. It was moving under its own steam, lurching across the quad, ploughing through stone. Its face was stone set, of course. Summerfield, a voice boomed from the unmoving mouth. I am the last, sole ruler of this place. King of kings, the cosmos is mine. Bow. Benny swore at him. Purged, the king rambled. Purged them all, you too. The head surged forward, and Benny caught sight of its malevolence. She was going to die here, murdered in the ruins of the dead city by its deranged ruler. That was not the way she wanted to go, indeedy no. She raised her gun and fired, blowing chips of stone from the implacable face. The damage was slight. The head kept coming while Benny emptied her gun. Disgusted, she hurled the gun at the Mandelbrot face. The stone jaws of the king closed around it. Crunch. Benny had left it too late to run. The Mandelbrot mouth was a black hole bounded by stone. It closed around her. Doctor! Crunch. Crunch. None of this is real. The tetrahedron screamed with light and fire. Trapped within, Benny screamed. The doctor's flesh burned, and he screamed. The scream became a storm of noise. The walls blistered into static. The bed opened up and swallowed Benny's corpse. Howling, the doctor grasped the tetrahedron as if to throttle it, and it spoke to him. It was not Benny's voice. It was a calm, plain voice. A grey voice. This is only a foretaste of what is to come. The doctor screamed. The grey voice spoke, whispering its instruction. Run, doctor, run, run, run. You can escape. You can be free. I don't want to run. I must stay and fight. Run. Irrationally he ran. The storm followed. It swirled round the tetrahedron, and the tetrahedron remained clutched in his hands. The voice urged him on, faster, deeper into the house. He fought it. This was cowardice. This was retreat. This was abandoning his friends and allies. This was defeat. No, this is your last chance. Somehow he clung to that thought. He hoped it might mean something. Mostly he ran. He ran and he ran and he ran, and he didn't stop running until the tall block rose before him, sturdy and unmoving in the reality storm. Police. Public call. Box. Ace bounced from wall to wall, clutching each new surface, drawing strength from their solidity. She no longer had any goal in mind, no aims, no motives. She kept moving, she kept surviving, she kept her mind off reality. Her constructive, logical thinking had given way to desperate defeatism. She knew when she was beaten. She knew when the enemy was bigger, better, faster, cleverer, wittier, and even sodding sexier than her. She knew a lost cause when she saw it, and she saw one all round her. "We've lost!" she yelled at each new wall. "We are the dead!" Yeah, she didn't care. It couldn't last. They'd get her eventually. She giggled, realizing she was getting paranoid. Had always been paranoid to a small degree. She stroked the nearest wall, finding its wooden strength reassuring. Then she saw the wall was dissolving. A shapeless rust was eating its fabric, a rust of reality. She looked down and saw a similar rust chewing at the carpet. The rust hummed and hissed like static. Not fair! How could she fight an enemy who could steal the boards from under her feet? She couldn't. She considered panicking. The floor became sparse. She kicked herself across the growing void and through the nearest door. It was Winterdawn's room. Reality rust ate the walls, but slowly. Her eyes fell on the bed. There was a rust shape where Benny's body should have been. Winterdawn was standing in the middle of the room, staring at her coolly. In one hand he hefted a poker, the very same item, she guessed, that she had almost used to smash the bodies of Gabriel and Tanith, his allies, his friends. She stared back at him, determined to wear down his gaze. He lost interest in her, his eyes flicking at random across the room. He prowled, pacing to the window. It hadn't been opened in 5 years. Winterdawn opened it now. He opened it with the poker, driving it clean through each pane. A shower of light glass shards glowed in the night, catching the light before the rust caught them. Winterdawn seemed satisfied with the destruction, though not satiated. Silently, without fuss, he wrenched at the curtains, tearing the material and breaking the runner. He tore and tore at the fabric until it was a bundle of rags. The destruction spread. Winterdawn smashed ornaments and knocked down furniture, kicking and beating until the weaker items were reduced to firewood. He wrenched paintings and photographs from the walls and dashed their glass facades to pieces on the floor before driving his feet onto each, obliterating art with stamped shoe prints. He tore pages from books, hurling them across the room until the carpet was obscured beneath a layer of paper snow. The words of Nabokov, Spinrad, Heller, Peake, and hundreds of others. Ace watched silently, enthralled by the competent violence. The final act of destruction was the simplest. Winterdawn tore the sheets from the bed, hurling them into the corners before setting to work on the mattress. The surface battered and broke, stuffing and springs bursting spontaneously from the tears. Pleased with the effect, the destroyer flung the poker away and turned, arms held wide apart like an actor declaiming. No, actors faked their feelings. The pain on Winterdawn's face was real. Now, he announced in grand declamatory tones, they've taken everything. His booming voice died away, consumed by silence. Winterdawn scanned Ace's face, looking for a reply. After a moment, he seemed to understand that none was forthcoming. He spoke quietly this time, muting his voice as if to hide the truth it contained. "My daughter is dead," he began. "I wanted her to see. They promised." Ace stepped forward, taking Winterdawn's hands. "They lie," Ace whispered. "I know," Winterdawn replied. His voice and eyes were obscured by pain. "You were stupid." "I was." "We'll destroy them." Winterdawn laughed creepily, made Ace feel stupid. He sank to his knees and Ace became aware that there was little holding him up. She glanced around her. The rust was spreading, as if fascinated by the destruction. Soon, the floor on which she and Winterdawn stood would be an island. She sank to her knees beside the professor, clasping her hands against his. It was strange that they should be together at the end. "Professor Winterdawn," she said. "Jeremy, I'm sorry." He stared at her, confusion in his eyes. "What for?" Ace almost cried. They huddled together, and the rust ate them as it ate the world. "You're too late," they said. "We've won," they said. "Here comes the night."